We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
On October 2nd, the Supreme Court resumes, and with it, all the fun of the fair. Now, the court docket already includes some significant cases involving the Chevron defense, social media, state action, and the First Amendment. Questions of criticism of public figures via trademarks, domestic violence, Second Amendment case, appropriation clause, bankruptcy, and the opioid liability. And of course, let's not forget some race cases. Now, who better to discuss all of this massive legal fanfare than Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, host of the excellent Uprising podcast, which you can check out on the pages of libertynation.com and all good podcast providers. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I have participated in the audience of a Supreme Court argument, too. I'll have you know that as well.
Well, I mean, that basically qualifies you more than Twitter, which is, sorry, I should not dead name social media companies anymore. X, right? It's X.
At Podcast Uprising.
At Podcast Uprising to go and check out Scott's wonderful content, always biting, always witty, and occasionally saucy. Not in that way. So, Scott, let's make a start on our special Supreme Court edition and talk about the court politics and composition. Your thoughts?
Yes, well, we're told by the legacy media, Mark, that the people want a Supreme Court ethics, the imposition of some ethics standard upon the Supreme Court. This is all in reference to the attacks on Justice Thomas and the way we see, I think, capture by the left of all manner of regulatory bodies. It makes sense for them to try to impose regulatory capture and processes on all manner of things, because who's going to control them, right?
Absolutely. Well, let's delve onto that. Let's dig into that ever so briefly, Scott, because we have, at the moment, you've got a Democrat-led Senate, you've got a Democrat in the White House. Now, I think, there's this whole thing, a deal that I would take. Now, I reckon that the Republican half of the country, or the more conservative or libertarian half of the country, maybe not the libertarians, but I reckon that the Republican half of the country would accept a revamping of an ethics, or a creation of an ethics board or panel or a set of strictures if they were allowed to do it. And what do you think about that? So let's say Democrats say we need an ethics code of conduct. And Republicans say, okay, sure, but we get to write it. Do you think they'd go for that deal?
Many Republican voters, I think, would go for that deal. I think it's ill-advised, though.
It is, isn't it? It's short-term thinking. But which brings us back to the point of the original. The Democrats are going for that now, and it's short-term thinking to let them go ahead with that.
Well, I would argue against it on multiple fronts, but my chief argument against it, and it's one that we don't hear many people making the case for, is that it's totally and completely unconstitutional, and it violates the constitutional strictures of separation of powers. What we have is that sort of in terms of leading politicians in the Senate, Dick Durbin, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and Chuck Schumer, I think is the former chairman of that committee and now leader of the Senate. He or they have tried to impose their will as legislators with their preferences upon the Supreme Court. And when they say they want the imposition of this board, it's through legislation that the Congress drafts and passes and the president signs. So that would be two branches of government colluding to impose burdens on a third branch, which is something we don't allow in our system. So, for instance, Mark, I just want people to think about it this way. Let's say that United States Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, and Chuck Schumer decided that Joe Biden should have to do certain things. So they just got together and said that this should happen and imposed some kind of, decree upon the president. Well, that's not what our Constitution says. And all these different institutions, their operating rules, they come from the United States Constitution, not from federal law, not from regulations passed by Congress or wished into being, by the people.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's the idea that they are three separate co-equal branches of government, and if one could legislate over the other, then it's no longer a co-equal branch, which kind of upsets the. It's like, imagine it's a three-legged stool and one leg's shorter than the other. You're going to fall off, right?
The court would be totally neutered if
Yes.
they allowed the Congress to impose these requirements on them.
And the thing is, what's really leading this, from what I can tell, is, as you say, it's that it's using accusations against Justice Clarence Thomas and his friendship with, I believe it's Harlan Crow, Mr. Harlan Crow, a billionaire, and his relationship. Even though there has been no laws broken, there's been no, as far as we know, like unethical gifts, that he's done nothing outside of what is normal practice for two lifelong friends. And yet people are ignoring the far more questionable scandals of Justice Sonia Sotomayor and having her taxpayer staff within the court selling her books. That's
So
not
there's lots to unpack there. Let's talk for a moment about Justice Thomas. He at the end of the summer filed an amended disclosure report. There were new regulations put forth by the U.S. Judicial Conference, which all of the United States Supreme Court justices have said they will voluntarily adhere themselves to those practices. And that, by the way, is the best practice for the court, which is to say that people deserve and demand transparency with certain aspects of the lives of the public officials, especially and including the Supreme Court. And it's great that the Supreme Court doesn't force the issue with trying to get us to, I think, what would be the appropriate way to impose new rules on them, which would be to amend the Constitution. And that's a fairly drastic act. So to the extent that the justices say, we will abide by these disclosure requirements and then do abide by them, we should, I think, celebrate that and just run with that as how we go. And that's what Justice Thomas filed pursuant to the new rules and regulations. And we learned a lot about his affairs with Mr. Crow. Now, I want to take issue with one thing that you said, which was that none of those transactions or dealings were kind of out of the ordinary that a normal person might have with another person. For most of those things, it's true, meaning if you're friends with somebody who is, middle class or lower class, and you go on vacations with them, it would be expected maybe that you would go to venues that you would ordinarily attend if you were in that class that financial class of being. Yeah. So the restaurants that you went to, the mode of travel that you did, they would all be sort of a kind. And also that would change if you happen to be friends with a billionaire like Mr. Crow is. Okay. So
sure. No Buc-ee's in an RV. Gotcha.
That's that. Well, it's funny because Justice Thomas is famously known for
he
loving
is famous
RV,
for his
right?
RV.
But you're right. But not a broke down, nasty RV, a nice
sure.
RV. But there are some transactions, namely that Mr. Crow purchased Justice Thomas's mother's home and property that Justice Thomas also had a financial interest in. So now that alone doesn't mean that it's scandalous, right? But it is a kind of, what's going on there? Now, according to Justice Thomas and according to Harlan Crow, what's going on there is he wishes to venerate Justice Thomas and his legacy. And so he actually purchased the property with a mind towards, making it I don't want to say tourist attraction because those aren't words that he used, but something along the lines of preserving it because of his, again, veneration of Justice Thomas. Now that's a little bit, outside the ordinary, but as long as Justice Thomas isn't weighing in on Harlan Crow's affairs as a justice, right? Whether sure. he's, ruling on things that directly affect Mr. Crow, then I think it stands to reason that this is, within the bounds of acceptable conduct. And if it's not, at least it's been disclosed. So now those who oppose Justice Thomas, if they wish to move to impeach him, they can do so on the facts. But it's also, one of the things that's an incumbent to say, I think, if we want to say that, for instance, Durbin has been, I think, Justice Thomas's chief, within the leadership, his biggest criticism, hosting these hearings that are poised at fact-finding, that critics of them might say we're not fact-finding at all, but just dressed up to attack justices on the right, and Justice Thomas specifically is, if you are, if the groups amassed against Justice Thomas are amassed against him because of his the political ramifications of his jurisprudence, and hate him and want to destroy him because of that, and really don't care about the judicial ethics of the situation, but they're just using that to not give a nod to that and understand it. In other words, we need Justice Thomas and all justices to abide by a high level of ethical standard, okay? And so it's important if somebody brings forward allegations that somebody didn't, that we address those allegations. And it's also important to recognize if all the people that are making those allegations really don't care about any of it, and they're just out to get Justice Thomas, which they've said those words directly in print. It's important to recognize that too. So I want to kind of play both sides of that and recognize that, I don't think it's odd that somebody raises an eyebrow that Harlan Crow bought Justice Thomas's mom's, homestead. And also, they don't care about that. All they care about is abortion and guns and other issues and the way that Justice Thomas votes on.
We'll be back talking Justice Thomas and the other justices and the left's attacks and the right attacks later on in the show after this short break. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.